Imagine standing in a crowd of 100,000 people, not at a concert, not at a celebration, but at an execution. The year is 1946. The city is Poznan, Poland. And the man being led up to that gallows isn't some faceless soldier. He's a governor, a decorated Nazi official, a man who once had the power to decide whether entire populations lived or died. And today, the people he once ruled are watching him hang. But here's what the history books skip over. This execution didn't just last seconds. It lasted much, much longer. And the crowd, they didn't look away. His name was Artur Greiser. And by the time you finish this video, you'll understand exactly why what happened to him that day was considered by many not brutal enough. There's a specific type of evil that history produces. Not the loud, screaming kind you see in movies, but the quiet, bureaucratic kind. The kind that wears a suit, signs documents, attends dinner parties, and somewhere between the paperwork and the wine glasses, orders the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. Artur Greiser was that kind of evil. He wasn't pulling triggers on a battlefield. He was sitting in an office, his office, in his palace, building what historians would later call a laboratory of genocide, a testing ground for everything the Nazi regime wanted to do to the rest of Europe. And the terrifying part, he was proud of it. This is the story of who he was, what he built, how he was caught, and how justice, slow, imperfect, and unforgettable, finally came for him. If you found this channel for the first time, you're in the right place. Nazi dark history exists because this story deserves to be told fully, honestly, and without flinching. Subscribe and hit the bell because we're just getting started. To understand the monster, you have to understand the man. And the man started small. Artur Karl Greiser was born on the 22nd of January, 1897, in Aschichau, to Wielkopolska, a quiet town in what was then the German Empire, sitting right on the cultural fault line between German and Polish identity. That tension, that blurry border between two worlds, would define his entire life. His childhood was unremarkable. His father was a local official. His family was respectable, but not wealthy. Young Arthur went to school, learned discipline, probably complained about homework like every other kid. Nothing about him screamed danger. Then World War I arrived, and everything changed. Greiser enlisted and eventually served as a naval aviator, flying reconnaissance missions over the North Sea. For a young man with no particular direction in life, the war gave him something intoxicating: purpose, structure, the feeling of being part of something bigger than himself. And then Germany lost. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just humiliate Germany as a nation, it humiliated men like Greiser personally. Veterans who had risked their lives came home to find economic collapse, political chaos, and a country that felt like it was dissolving. The identity Greiser had built in uniform, gone, just like that. Here's where the story takes a turn most people miss. After the war, Greiser didn't immediately become a radical. He tried to rebuild normally. He got married, his first wife Maria, by all accounts a quiet, private woman. He tried business ventures. He tried to plant roots in Danzig, the port city that had been carved out of Germany's territory and turned into a free city under League of Nations supervision. He failed in business repeatedly. And there's something almost painfully human about that. A proud man, a war veteran, watching himself fail in peacetime while the world moved on without him. If this were any other story, that might be the moment of growth, the humbling, the turning point towards something better. But this isn't that story. Instead of growing, Greiser hardened. Instead of accepting failure, he looked for someone to blame. And the Nazi Party, rising, loud, and offering exactly the kind of identity a broken man craves, was right there waiting. He joined the NSDAP and the SS in the early 1930s.
And unlike the true believers who joined for ideology, Greiser joined for status. He wanted power. He wanted people to stand when he walked into a room. He wanted a title. He got everything he asked for. By 1933, he had risen to become president of the Danzig Senate, essentially the top political authority of the Free City. And in that role, he proved one crucial thing to his Nazi superiors. Artur Greiser would do whatever was necessary to deliver results. No hesitation, no questions, no mercy. That quality, that dangerous, eager ruthlessness, put him on a very specific list. The list of men the Nazi regime trusted to run the territories they were about to conquer. And in September 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Within weeks, Greiser was handed something that no bureaucrat-turned-politician could ever dream of: total control over an entire region. He was appointed Reichsstatthalter and Gauleiter of the newly created Reichsgau Wartheland, the Warthegau, a massive chunk of western Poland forcibly annexed into the Reich. 4.9 million people, overnight, his. And what Greiser did next is the reason 100,000 people showed up to watch him die. Most Nazi-occupied territories were brutal. The Warthegau was something different. Historians don't use the word laboratory lightly, but that's exactly what Greiser built. He didn't just occupy Polish land, he tried to erase it. Erase its language, its culture, its people, its memory. He wanted to take a living, breathing civilization and replace it completely with a German one. And he had permission to experiment. Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS, gave Greiser unusual freedom, more than other regional governors, more than most men in the entire Nazi system, because Greiser had proven himself eager, efficient, and completely unbothered by human cost. That combination in 1939 was considered a feature, not a flaw. Within months of taking power, Greiser launched one of the largest forced displacement operations in European history. Hundreds of thousands of Poles were torn from their homes, sometimes given 30 minutes to pack, sometimes less, and thrown into transit camps before being expelled eastward into the general government zone. Families separated, elderly people left in the cold, children transported in unheated cattle cars in the middle of winter, and their homes immediately given to ethnic Germans brought in from the Baltic states and Soviet-occupied territories. The Nazis called it Heim ins Reich, home into the Reich. As if stolen houses could become homes by simply changing the name on the door. But Greiser wasn't finished, not even close. The Polish language was banned. Catholic churches were seized or demolished. Polish schools ceased to exist. Priests were arrested, deported, or shot. The entire cultural infrastructure of a people, centuries old, was being methodically dismantled. And Greiser documented all of it, proudly. In letters to Berlin, he boasted about his progress. He competed with other regional governors over who was Germanizing their territory faster. There was almost something tragically absurd about it. This man, who had failed at every peacetime ambition, had finally found something he was terrifyingly good at: destroying things.
Now, here's the moment where this story crosses a line it can never come back from. In late 1941, something new was built on Greiser's territory. In a small village called Chelmno nad Nerum, known in German as Kulmhof, the Nazis constructed the first dedicated extermination facility in occupied Europe. Not a concentration camp, not a labor camp, an extermination facility built for one purpose only. The method used at Chelmno was gas vans, enclosed trucks where carbon monoxide from the engine exhaust was pumped directly into the sealed cargo compartment. Victims, mostly Jews from the Warthegau, were told they were being resettled. They were told to leave their labeled luggage so they could collect them later. They were loaded into the vans, the doors were locked, the engine was started. It took approximately 15 minutes. Between December 1941 and the spring of 1943 alone, an estimated 150,000 to 180,000 people were murdered at Chelmno.
The man who had ruled 4.9 million people with absolute authority, who had signed deportation orders without blinking, who had requested extermination quotas like budget approvals, that man ran. In January 1945, as Soviet forces approached the Warthegau, Greiser fled westward. He didn't stay to face the consequences of what he'd built. He didn't make some dramatic last stand. He grabbed what he could and disappeared into the chaos of a collapsing Reich. For weeks, he moved through the rubble of Nazi Germany, hiding, traveling under assumed circumstances, trying to become invisible in a country that was falling apart around him. But history has a way of catching up. In May 1945, American forces captured Artur Greiser in the Austrian Alps. He was found not leading a resistance, not dying heroically by his own hand like some of his colleagues, but hiding quietly, hoping nobody would notice. They noticed. He was handed over to Polish authorities, and what happened next inside that courtroom in Poznan was a reckoning that shook all of post-war Europe. June 1946, Poznan, Poland. The city was still scarred. Buildings still showed bullet holes. Families were still searching for missing relatives. The wounds of occupation, 6 years of them, were raw, open, and everywhere. And into this broken city, they brought Artur Greiser. The Supreme National Tribunal of Poland convened what would become one of the most significant war crimes trials in European history, happening almost simultaneously with the more famous Nuremberg proceedings, but receiving a fraction of the international attention. The courtroom was packed. Journalists from across Europe attended. Survivors testified. Documents were presented. His own documents, letters, memos, official orders, all bearing his signature, all describing in cold administrative language the destruction of human lives. And Greiser sat there, watching, listening, in a suit that probably still fit him well. Here's what made the trial extraordinary: the sheer volume of evidence. Unlike some Nazi defendants, who could claim limited knowledge or disputed chain of command, Greiser had documented himself into a corner. His own pride had buried him. Every boastful letter to Berlin, every progress report on Germanization, every memo requesting expanded killing operations, all of it entered into evidence. The prosecution didn't need to work very hard, but Greiser tried anyway. His defense strategy was one that would become familiar from other Nazi trials. He was following orders. He had no independent authority. The decisions came from above, from Himmler, from Hitler, from Berlin. He was an administrator, not an architect, a cog, not an engine. It was a defense built entirely on cowardice. Because here's what the evidence showed. Greiser hadn't reluctantly followed orders. He had enthusiastically exceeded them. He had written to Himmler asking for more permission to kill. He had competed with other governors over the speed of his ethnic cleansing.
He had personally intervened in cases to ensure harsher treatment of Polish civilians. At one point during the trial, a survivor testified about conditions in the transit camps, the cold, the starvation, the deliberate humiliation, and the courtroom went completely silent. Greiser reportedly looked at the table.
Whatever he had told himself in the years between 1939 and that courtroom, whatever internal story had allowed him to sleep at night, it wasn't working anymore. The verdict was never really in doubt. On the 9th of July, 1946, Artur Greiser was found guilty of crimes against peace, war crimes, and crimes against humanity. The sentence was death. But not just death, public death by hanging in Poznan, in the place he had governed, in front of the people he had tried to destroy. There was a certain poetry to that, and the Polish tribunal knew it. Greiser immediately appealed. He wrote letters to the Polish president, to international bodies, to anyone who might listen. He asked for clemency. He asked for mercy. The appeals were denied, every single one. And on the morning of the 21st of July, 1946, Artur Greiser was driven to the citadel of Poznan, the same city where he had once hosted dinners and signed death warrants, and walked toward a gallows erected on a hill in full public view. The crowd that gathered that morning was somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people. Let that number settle. That isn't a protest. That isn't a concert. That is an entire city and beyond showing up to witness one moment of justice after 6 years of systematic horror. They came from villages that had been emptied. They came as survivors of camps. They came as families who had lost everything. They came as people who had hidden in forests and cellars and churches while this man's machinery of destruction moved through their world. And they came quietly.
That's what witnesses reported. The crowd was enormous, but not chaotic, not screaming, just present, watching, bearing witness. Greiser was brought to the platform. He was given no special ceremony, no final speech opportunity that would let him perform dignity he hadn't earned. The process was deliberate and public and unhurried. The noose was placed around his neck. And here is the detail that history remembers. The hanging did not go cleanly. Whether by error or by the age of the equipment, Greiser did not die quickly. He suffered. The death was prolonged. The crowd watched in near silence as it happened. Afterward, his body was left on display. It was not a moment of celebration. Survivors who were there described it differently, as a closing, as something that needed to happen for the accounting of history to feel even partially complete. Not joy, not revenge in the way movies portray revenge. Something heavier than that.
Something that doesn't have a clean English word. Artur Greiser is not as famous as Göring or Himmler or Eichmann. His name doesn't appear in every Holocaust textbook, and that obscurity is itself a kind of injustice, because what he built in the Warthegau was in many ways the blueprint for what the Nazi regime attempted everywhere else. He proved it could be done. He proved that an entire region could be demographically re-engineered through terror, deportation, and mass murder. And the rest of the Reich took notes. Over 750,000 people died under his authority. Entire communities ceased to exist. A culture that had been rooted in that land for centuries was nearly erased, not by war, but by policy, by choice, by a man who wanted a title and found the worst possible way to earn one.
The rope at Poznan Citadel couldn't undo any of that. But it said something that still matters. That some crimes are so vast, so deliberate, so human in their cruelty, that the only honest response history has is to remember them completely. Not comfortably, not from a safe distance, completely. If this video made you think, if it made you feel the weight of what real history actually costs, then share it. Because stories like Greiser's don't exist to shock you. They exist to make sure that the 750,000 people who were erased from that land are never forgotten again. Subscribe to Nazi Dark History, and we'll keep telling the stories that need to be told.